Welcome back to episode 6 of Limited Time Only. I'm Hayden Dale from Arsenal Pass, host of Limited Time Only, a podcast all about things limited in flesh and blood, specifically Season 1 focused on draft and Outsiders, the Outsiders limited format. Now, on the pod this week, we've got an amazing guest who's just come fresh off the back of a top 4 at Pro Tour Baltimore. Juha Saarnilampi played Dromite at that amazing top 4. If you saw that titan of a game between himself and PT winner Michael Fing, just a game to behold. But also, Juha 6-0'd in draft at Baltimore. So, wanted to get Juha on the pod to talk about the experience and the lead up and all the testing and the big learnings that came out of what a 6-0 draft run looks like at the highest level at Pro Tour Baltimore. Now, had a few weeks off since the last pod with Alan Lau and talking drafting Ranger. Back at it now. Been away, traveling a little bit for work, and then of course we had the Pro Tour week where we put out some gameplay, and we took a couple of weeks off from Limited Time Only, but we're back here now with episode 6. We do also next week have an episode coming on Ninja, rounding out our sort of 3-series pod on fundamentals of drafting each of the classes in Outsiders Limited, which you can check out. And then we've got a few other amazing guests to kind of round out the end of Season 1 of Limited Time Only. We will also be doing a few things for Monarch Limited with the big announcement that Monarch is going to be the draft format for the national season coming up in a few months' time. Very, very exciting. But before then, we do have, of course, the Road to National season, which is kicking off this week for certain regions, particularly Europe and parts of Asia, and then for North America and other parts of the world the following weekend. I will be hopefully attending a couple of draft Road to Nationals, but focusing more on the Classic Constructed Road to Nationals, trying to punch that ticket to Nationals. Save a PTI, ideally. We'll see what happens, but I know there's going to be a lot of people out there on their way to draft Road to Nationals, so make sure to check out that content next week on Drafting Ninja. If you're still, maybe you've heard Alan Lau talk about Ranger, you've of course heard Chu Hing of talk about Assassin, and next week we'll be talking all things Ninja, and of course a bit of a recap this week with Juha on drafting and at the highest level for Outsiders Limited. So, last thing I want to say before we get into the main part of the pod and the interview with Juha is if you're enjoying the content that we're putting out here at Arsenal Pass, then make sure you do give us a sub, give us a like on these videos. Maybe even drop a comment. Let us know what you're enjoying about these videos, what you're excited about for this upcoming Road to Nationals and National season. I ask Juha the big question: what do you think about Monarch for National season? But we'd also love to hear what you all think out there as well. So let us know in the comments below. With that said, let's get in and let's bring Juha on to talk about drafting at Pro Tour Baltimore and his amazing result. And welcome to the show for episode 6 of Limited Time Only. I have recent top 4 competitor at Pro Tour Baltimore, Juha Saarnilampi. Welcome, Juha. Thanks for coming on the show. Really excited to have you on. Maybe just give this opportunity for you to tell us a bit about who you are and your kind of history in flesh and blood if people haven't seen you before.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. First, big fan. Limited Time Only actually was one of the reasons I did well at the PT. So super happy to be on. But I'm Juha. I'm a fab dad from Helsinki, Finland. I'm kind of repping the Finnish and the Nordic scenes. Shout outs to both. And of course, all the fab parents out there repping that community, hopefully, as well. The Nordic scene is probably where I get most of my testing in, the kind of testing that is actually against strong players. But mostly I'm a Talishar grinder, to be honest. I have a 6-month-old daughter at home, which means I get very little planned testing time. So whenever I get 30 minutes here and there, I try to grab it and play a game on Talishar.
And I know just before we jumped on to record, you told me that you've been playing since 2021 Road to Nationals, and I think I knew in the past, but you reminded me as well, thankfully, that you also top-aided Utrecht as well. Back in, that was early 2022, was it? That was before Leo, right?
Well, that was mid 2022. So in I think it was July 2022, back in the FI heyday. I think it was before the stubbies were banned. So those were fun times.
I remember there being a lot of FI mirrors at that event in particular.
Yep.
I want to, Juha, I want to ask you a question. This episode is all about talking about some of your learnings from Pro Tour, and Juha 6-0 draft at the PT is something to behold. It's definitely not easy to do in a really incredible field, and as well as I think you went X2 in Classic Constructor to take you into top 8. But I want to ask a question first, and I actually didn't put this on the notes, Juha, so I'm going to spring it on you a little bit. But European players in Flesh and Blood have, I would say, not seen some of the limelight as maybe some of your North American counterparts have. And I want to give this opportunity to just tell us a bit about just how strong the European scene is. I know even in the Nordic area where you come from, there's a lot of really good players out there. Maybe you can just plug a little bit about kind of, some of the players and what it's like competing in that region. It's because what I understand is there's a lot of really good players out your way.
There are a lot of really, really good players. And I think it might be less of a common scene across Europe. So, we don't play each other maybe that much as much as the US players do. But we, of course, travel to the events whenever we get them. Luckily, we've gotten a few now, and expecting the Worlds, of course. But really, really strong players. Of course, everybody knows about Matthew Folks. Everybody knows about some of the other strong UK players, Jamie Faulkner on his Tromai, for example, and his limited strength as well. And Ian from the Netherlands was 9th at the PT, insanely strong in both constructed and limited. And actually, there's a Discord where we got to test some of the drafting against some of the top European players, and Jamie was there and Ian was there. So even though I got only a few drafts in, the level of competition was high enough that it really, really helped me. So big thanks to the strong European scene for my success as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to kind of shout that out because I think it's something we don't see as much of, unfortunately, in kind of some of the content that's out there and some of the coverage and things like that. And a big part of the reason I wanted to have you on as well. And we've got Pablo coming on in a couple of weeks as well. Another obviously incredible European player there as well. So yeah, I'm excited to see be back in Europe for Worlds as well, and playing against these top European players. So we're going to talk a bit about drafting at the Pro Tour. You alluded to a little bit of the kind of testing and things you did. I wanted to ask, first of all, what's your kind of experience with Limited and Flesh and Blood, and what are your thoughts on Outsiders as a limited format?
I think Limited and Flesh and Blood is probably the toughest thing to get right. I got the feeling from the game early on that it was very, very constructed heavy in its design. And the constructed is just absolutely perfect. It is by far the best game I've ever played. The limited side has a little bit more, that it needs, because I'm coming from Magic. I wasn't a very strong Magic player ever, but I drafted a lot of MTG cube, like power cube drafting, and that's the most fun you can have, I think, with card games. And just the huge gap that there is between the enjoyment factor of Fab draft versus Magic Cube draft. I think that's where they need to put a lot of effort in the future. Just the amount of dimensions that are there, right? Because it's a hero-based game, which makes it really, really tough. You can't have this mix and match set up very easily of taking one color and then staying open for the other and figuring out what's going on at the table and so on. But I think they can still do a lot more. The hybrid cards were a positive surprise. The very limited nature of the hybrid cards was a negative surprise, right? That there was only basically one per pack, and there was no Ninja Ranger hybrid. So I think they need to really up the game on the various dimensions that you need to kind of cross optimize while you're drafting. So it's not on rails, because currently the way it kind of is that it starts to be on rails from pick 3 to 5 in Uprising, or from pick 6 to 12 in Outsiders, and that's really the variance. So how can you make it so that it's not on rails until early pack 2, for example, or mid pack 2, that would be the dream.
Yeah, every extra little bit of openness, or like you say, staying off those rails for a little bit longer, just adds potential deviations and interesting scenarios that come up. And I definitely feel that way as well, particularly with Uprising. It felt like, once you got on towards the end of pack 1, it was just about making sure that you optimized your picks and making sure you're just taking basically the correct pick based on the experience you have and the learnings you have to have the right 30 cards when you shuffle up and play. I felt that a little bit different personally in Outsiders to a degree, where maybe because it is a newer format, we didn't play it for 8 months like we did for Uprising, but that there was a little bit more variation in what you can do with the decks, with the 6 heroes. But yeah, I mean, like you say, a step in the right direction, but hopefully we'll continue to see Limited grow, and I think we're both on the same page about how important we think Limited might be to the future of the game as well, if they can get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. The 6 heroes, that was a fantastic idea. I didn't think of it myself, but a really, really cool idea that adds a little bit more of those open dimensions to a very on rails game.
Yep. While we're talking about Limited briefly, I want to ask you, because it's just been announced that, or at the PT where you were in Baltimore, been announced that we're going to be playing Monarch for Nationals in the draft format, as well as a few other things surrounding that as well. What's your thoughts? Have you drafted Monarch before? Are you excited, looking forward to it, dreading it? What's your kind of thoughts on maybe Monarch coming back as the next Limited format for a short time?
I'm more dreading it than anything else. I've never drafted a single draft of Monarch. I started in the Monarch season, but Monarch draft wasn't really a competitive format anywhere outside, I guess, New Zealand and Taiwan. I haven't drafted it. I'm really looking forward to try it out, to be honest. I think it could be a lot of fun. But I will not, of course, have a lot of testing time. So I will, even in the Nationals, I will probably be behind some of the stronger players in Finland. So dreading it a little bit, but I think it's a really, really fun idea to make sure that you have 3 drafting seasons during 2023 as well.
Yep.
But of course, I'm hoping it doesn't happen again. I'm hoping next year we have 3 draftable sets. That's the dream, right?
Yeah, agree. I would love to just draft more. I mean, Monarch, I don't mind Monarch. It's definitely not my favorite, but it's not my least favorite. Probably sits somewhere in the middle. So I don't mind revisiting it. But like you say, I'd love to see some freshness next year. All right, let's talk drafting at the Pro Tour. What everyone wants to hear you talk about, rather than me rattle on about Monarch draft. I want to learn a little bit about your lead up to the PT. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you prepared for the PT, and what are some things that helps you get to the 6-0 record? What about draft specifically sort of set you up for success? I know you talked about drafts of some of the top European players. Was there that plus other things?
Yeah. So maybe very, very quickly on the CC side. So having only very little testing time and very sporadically here and there against mostly randoms online meant that instead of locking my deck in maybe a week in advance, I had to lock my deck in a month in advance. I made the smart choice of doing that. So I locked Dromai well in advance after I had kind of given up on Uzuri in my brewing. I got 80, 90 CC games in, something like that, mostly online. So that was kind of my CC prep. My draft prep was trying to play some of these online drafts on this server with some of the strongest European players, with some North Americans jumping in here and there. So I got to play Yuki, for example, which was a lot of fun, although both of our Riptide decks were extremely horrible. But that was a learning experience as well. So I got, I think, 7 online drafts in, and then a couple, or I would say, 1.5 live drafts in Baltimore on the Thursday. So very, very little prep compared to what I would really like it to be. I would like to draft maybe upwards of 20 times at least. But I think given the competition and given the thinking I did in between the drafts and after the drafts on, what does a good deck look like? What did the winning decks look like? We had the deck list up always, so I could take a look at the top decks, the winning decks. I could do some math on the pod win rates actually on that server, which was super, super useful. So, and of course, then I listened to your podcast. I listened to On the Bobble, where they did some limited reviews and so on. Super useful to get some of the insights that I didn't have time in my 9 drafts to get myself. Like, for example, how do you draft Riptide correctly? I never learned that myself, but I learned it from the content I listened to.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talked about breaking down post the drafts, and I think that's something that people might not do a lot of. They might just play the draft, they draft out their deck, they play the games, and then they pop it in the deck box or they break it down, and that's the end of the draft. But it sounds like for you, there's more to it. There's a bit of analysis post the draft. What does that kind of look like for you? What are you trying to learn? And I guess what did you learn from doing that?
Yeah, I think the first thing I often think of after draft is was I drafting the correct class or hero for the seat? What could I have done differently? What signals could I have read differently? What signals that I sent could I have acted on differently? That kind of stuff. Or was it, if I end up 1-2 or something, and my deck wasn't that good, was it my own fault, or was it just randomly people switching? That kind of stuff. So it was very useful to see kind of what the entire pod drafted. So the hero split. So that tells me a lot about whether my seat was correct or not. And sometimes you draft the correct hero for the seat, but it still ends up badly. And especially in those cases, you need to think about what were the cards you picked. Did you have the wrong understanding of what a good deck for that hero looks like, which very early on in the format is very often the case, because you don't. For example, in the beginning, I didn't really realize what a good Riptide deck or what a good Azalea deck looks like. And I probably thought that there was more cards split between them that you could kind of pick for both, whereas their pools are actually very, very different in reality. You see me talking a lot about Ranger because out of the now 11 drafts after the PT, I think I've drafted Ranger 6 times. Seem to have a clear bias for the class, all the way to the point where at the going into the PT, I told myself, do not draft Ranger. You have a bias for it. Try to avoid it if you can. But yeah, then what happened is I drafted Azalea in my first draft.
Okay, yeah, and obviously went 3-0, so it worked out. One of the things that I find, similar to your kind of learnings, is one of my most important things with draft is the post draft. Sometimes even I found getting later into testing seasons, we might only draft and then play like one round, and where a lot of the important information or learnings I find comes is in that kind of post draft. That analysis you talked about. I know for us, like if we're doing in-person drafts, then we'll sit afterwards and we'll break down what we each learned from the pod and what we thought we would have done differently or should have done differently. Analyze some of the picks if we can. People will often note down or take a picture of like really important picks to come back to, so that, as a discussion point, those learnings, like you talked about, in this instance, did I take the right card that maybe let me into the right hero between the class in this set is quite important, or did I identify the pivot at the right point, or did I identify the pivot too late and put the person I left into the same hero or same class in the set that I ended up drafting? There's so many, I think, fascinating things when it comes to those, particularly first 6 to 7 picks like you talked about, and then also just analyzing what you can learn to take away. I personally, I find there's the draft and there's the gameplay, and they're two pretty unique things, and I think you need to treat them as such. Get your draft learnings and then get your gameplay learnings separately if you can. Helps a lot.
Absolutely.
So talking about your drafts at the PT, so you drafted Azalea in your first draft, you went 3-0, and then in your second draft, what hero did you draft in the second?
Uzuri in my second draft. So I stayed away from my Ranger bias for once. And I think both of those, of course, when you 3-0, you probably drafted the right hero for the seat. But both of those felt like it, yeah.
Well, just going back a little second to your preparation, what are some of the big learnings you had in those? I know you said you only got 9.5, 11 drafts in, whatever it might have been, but what were some of the big things you took away as you were heading into the PT from your learnings?
I think there were 2 really big ones. One was around Rangers, because that's what I ended up drafting around half the time or a bit more. I learned that Ranger is a little bit special, and you need to be super, super careful going into it. Because first of all, Riptide has a really bad pod win rate compared to the number of Riptides picked. And part of the reason is that like the train wreck garbage fire decks, they often end up on Riptide or they end up on Uzuri, because if you have bad stealth cards and maybe a couple payoffs, you might end up on Uzuri. If you have a bad ranger deck, then you end up on Riptide. And that's why those two heroes have a lower pod win rate probably than the others. But the Riptide one is even significantly lower. So you really, really want to avoid Riptide unless you know exactly what you're doing. And given that the kind of winning Riptide deck probably has 35 plus cards, has a lot of traps, maybe some come to fights can sub in for some of the traps, but you need a lot of these cards that can get around Spider's Bites. And traps are of course perfect for that because they serve a double purpose. And you need a lot of good arrows. You don't necessarily want a lot of pumps. I mean, they can be good. Some of the good pumps are of course good in Riptide, but it looks very, very specific because it's a fatigue deck, because you have no way to push damage, so it has to be a fatigue deck. So you need the amount of cards, and what that means is that if you're targeting to draft like 37 playables into your deck, you can't dabble in other classes for very long. So you need to be super careful. And then the fact that Riptide looks very different than Azalea, because all Azalea wants is a lot of pumps, almost as many as you can get, and arrows, and preferably nothing else. Maybe some toxicities, maybe some Ravenous Rabble Reds in there, but even in my PT deck, I cut the Ravenous Rabble Red from my Azalea deck because I thought it was going to be better without it. So the fact that those are very different, and they probably need to be on an open hero, means that you need to be super careful going into Ranger. Mm-hmm. But of course, still, if you notice it's truly open, pick 6 or 7 or something like that, you notice you're getting a Lace with Frailty or something like that, then you can go, and that's exactly what happened in my PT draft. But a broken Azalea deck is still broken, and it has a decent, a very good pod win rate. Riptide, you need to be super careful, right? Because if you've wasted your first 4 picks on something else, then you're probably screwed already. The other learning I had was around kind of the cards that seem to keep you open. They often don't, right? Because many of the generics are not truly generic, and even many of the hybrid cards are not going to all the heroes. And again, this is a bit of a Ranger example, but given the fact that Azalea doesn't want almost any of the generics, except of course Scout and Ravenous Rabble, maybe Seek Horizon, and Come to Fight, of course. But it doesn't want the freewheeling Renegades. It doesn't want the feisty locals, these things that you think of as like truly generics that go everywhere. It means that many cards like freewheeling Renegades, it actually already puts you on some direction, as well as things like the traps, or cards like Death Touch or Pox Malone, whatever it's called, Virulent Touch. It's not really going into 4 heroes, it's going into 3 heroes. And you need to really keep that in mind when you're drafting these cards, that some of them are actually Assassin Ninja cards and not generics. Also due to the fact that you rarely want to go Riptide. So if you'd like to avoid Riptide if possible, and Azalea wants very specific cards, meaning that many of the generics are actually Assassin Ninja cards.
Would you say similar for maybe a card like Out the Periphery, for instance? Is that that's a card I know a lot of people don't want to be playing in Uzuri in particular. Like, would you say similar for that, or would you find that most of those will always go into Assassin pretty easily?
Scout, I think, is mostly an Azalea card, to be honest. You can play it in Riptide, no problem, but it's it doesn't shine there. But it is very much an Azalea card, so that's a perfect example of a generic that's not really a generic. So what this all means is that the decision tree of how you pick your hero is not straightforward in this set. So what I kind of did at the PT is my thinking was I try to stay open for Assassin and Ninja, and I pick generics, and I pick Assassin Ninja cards or things like that keep me open on those two, and then I read the signals on which classes are cut and which classes might be open. And I would pick out of those two the one that feels more open, unless I see, pick 5 to 7 that Ranger truly is open. In which case I can look at my pool, or I can think of what I had in my pool. Does it support still going into Riptide? And if I have wasted too many picks, it probably doesn't. In which case I can still probably go Azalea, especially if I have a Scout in there, or a Ravenous Rabble, or a Come to Fight in there, or something like that. Then in that special case I would go Ranger, and otherwise I would try to pick the more open one of the Assassin and Ninja classes. So it's a strange form of a decision tree.
Yeah, it's my takeaway from this draft format is, in these early picks, it's all about margins. You start to get picks that are actually, on the surface of it, they look not very close. There's a card that's just in a vacuum more powerful, but considering the information you have at hand and the risk you're taking on potentially taking the more powerful card versus a less powerful card that might go into more of what you think is potentially open on with the information you have so far, these decisions start to add up, and they come quickly. You don't have long to make these picks in a time draft like people will be facing come Road to National season, come of course like you had at the PT, callings, etc. So it's not an easy thing to do either.
Yeah.
What about, I guess, some of the preferences you had in draft? I know you talked just then about you'd like to stay open for Ninja, Assassin, and then if the Ranger was open, particularly Azalea, you'd jump in. So it sounds like to me, forcing a hero was kind of off the table for you. Is that where you kind of stood in this format?
Absolutely. This is not a format where you force a hero, in my mind. I heard some people do it successfully, and of course, if you're known to be the ninja drafter and everybody at the pod knows that you are the ninja drafter, of course that helps. But I don't think that happened very much. So you really want to stay open. But you can also stay open while picking strong class cards. So that's completely fine. In my second draft, I first picked a Surging Strike Red, and I ended up on Uzuri. So it's completely fine. You don't. And I think in my first one, I had a Red Infect and a Red Razor's Edge in my pool before I switched to Ranger. So you can also stay open while picking strong class cards. That's fully possible, especially for the heroes that are fine playing 30 cards. So for Riptide, you can't really do that.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of people kind of talking about the format, and something that I've kind of disagreed with is, and similar to what you talked about, is people saying, okay, the 6 power reds, they're like, okay, those are my instant first picks if they're in my pack because they're the card that keeps me the most open. I think like you just talked about pretty specifically, that's not necessarily true. It's not keeping you open to all 6 heroes. And I guess what people have also said that they don't want to do is people like, I don't want to take a class card first pick. But you're not married to your first pick, you don't have to play that first pick. And I think it's really important for people to understand that and keep that in mind, is that yes, you're going to get more powerful cards at the start of the draft. And so you don't want to be burning picks, but also if you set yourself up in the right class and you take maybe a risk here or there, you're going to get rewarded with more powerful cards in later packs anyway. So it's a real balancing act. I think it's important to remember that.
Absolutely.
What about, we talked about staying open. You talked about your massive experience with Ranger, or, the majority of your experience being in Ranger heading into the PT and staying open to Ninja Assassin. Did you have a preference between those two? Like if you got the perfect seat in every draft, would you have been Azuri or Arachne, for instance, or would you have been happy being a Benji or a Katsu?
I think I had a bit more experience with Ninja, so probably I would have gone that way. It also fits my playstyle a little bit more. I'm traditionally an aggro player. I played a lot of Fi in the Uprising draft. So probably Ninja, but pretty even between those.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we talk about some cards, because you've talked a lot about concepts and the sort of things you're looking for, but you open up that pack one, pick one. What are the cards that you're ideally looking for? When you open this pack one, pick one. I know you talked about generics maybe not being the be all and end all like people have talked about. So is there specific class cards you think are so powerful you just want to see, or is there maybe just very specific generics?
Come to Fight Red is what I would always want to see, because it goes into everything. I guess it's not the best in Ninja, but it's still very playable in Ninja. It's very, very good against Spider's Bites. So it's kind of the worst case scenario against Assassin is that you block for 3 after a Spider's Bite, which is a really, really good use case for it. But of course, in Azalea, in Assassin with these on-hit stealth cards, it's really good to also pump them. So that's one. The good 2 for 6s, absolutely. So I would like to open a Red Humble, for example. You don't really want it in the perfect Azalea, but it's playable there. But at least it goes very, very well in the other 5 heroes. Or then just some of the strongest cards in the set, like Death Touch Red, or Bonds Red, or Looking for a Scrap Red. Looking for a Scrap is that I really like. It's an Assassin Ninja card, but it's a really, really strong one.
Yep. I think it's one of the strongest first picks in the set, to be honest. My takeaway, when it's in those decks, it's just the power that card brings to you in skewing, overall damage and turn cycles is really big. I wanted to talk a little bit about something that's kind of been, I know, a topic that was discussed by a few players at the PT and this kind of set in general and how it differs to some of the previous sets we've seen, and that's around equipment. We heard at the start how people were not that inspired by equipment, and then people were saying how powerful equipment was, and then people seem to have come back the other way. So what's your take on equipment in the set? How important is it to you in draft? Kind of whereabouts are you taking it in the draft, and what equipment do you think is, if any, the better of the equipment?
I think there's a big range in the equipment. I started drafting it super highly early on in the format, but I came down a little bit. Currently, my thinking is that Tunic is a very high pick. You usually want the Tunic in your deck. It just makes almost any deck better. Especially the Rangers, just really, really fantastic to be able to shoot an arrow off a 0-card hand, for example. So that's kind of at the very top. And then for Azalea, you want the Wayfinder's Crest, super, super high. Or you want to just make sure that you have it. I mean, of course, you can, if you read the table, you figure out there are not that many Azaleas on the table. You don't need to pick one early because you might, likely see one later. Same with Mask of Many Faces for Ninja. You just really, really want it in your deck. And then after that, you have every Blade Break equipment, basically. You want to make sure you have 1 or 2 of those in your deck, preferably 2. For all the breakpoints, and for the Benji shenanigans and all that, and then everything else is I would say far behind. The Silken Gi, I'm not a huge fan of. Seeker's equipment is fine paired with Peace of Mind. It's also fine in Azalea in multiples, but not that great. And the Fleetfoot Sandals, they were actually surprisingly good. Especially in Assassin, I actively seek out the Fleetfoot Sandals late on in the draft, because you can do cool things like attack with Spider's Bite, attack with Sneak Attack, and then you Fleetfoot the Spider's Bite, and cool things like that. Or just anyway, you attack with a blue stealth card on your Uzuri deck, and they double block it because they really, really don't want to take it, and then you Fleetfoot and it leads to some crazy throws. So. Yeah, exactly. So it's been surprisingly good compared to the early set reviews where you look at the card and you're like, oh my god, this is the worst Snapdragon I've ever seen.
Yeah, that sounds like a dig at me, and I was definitely most wrong on that card, I would say. As soon as I at the pre-release, I did exactly what you just said. Spider's Bite into Red Sneak Attack in an Arachne deck, popped it on my Spider's Bite. My opponent was like, wait, what? I'm like, yeah, that's how that works. And I was like, okay, yeah. I think I was wrong on this card. And then immediately in the next game, or the next pre-release when I was playing Uzuri, same sort of thing you talked about, came in with a blue attack, Fleetfoot Sandals, then come in just with the 6 power afterwards. So it's card's quite a bit better than some of us thought early on.
I think all of us were on the same train of it being super weak.
We should have known. Why would LSS just print this completely useless card? Of course they didn't. So, good learnings, I think. Like you say about equipment, I think where they stand. I know Blade Breakers come really highly for almost everyone, I think, who's practiced this draft format a lot because of those breakpoints like you talked about. I think some of the ones like Seekers, some of the non-specific to a hero, Silk and Gi, for instance, like you said, maybe come down a bit more. I want to ask you before we sort of talk a bit more about the PT and then do pick one with you, is Peace of Mind. Do you like the card? Do you not like the card? It seems like it's one of the most divisive cards in this format for whatever reason.
I'm so and so. I can take it. It's fine. It goes to most decks. I'm not high on it. I'm not like super low on it. It's fine. If you get the Seekers and the Peace of Mind and the blue and you get to use all of that damage prevention, then you're living the dream. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes you draw it without a blue and you need to use it. Sometimes it clunks up your hand where you want to be blocking for more and you need to use 2 cards to block for 3 or 4 or whatever. It's fine, but not great.
Okay, so we've got a fence sitter. That's what I'm hearing. Which is fine. Yeah, I'm not sure I have a strong feeling either way. I do like the card. I like ponder tokens. I want ponder tokens. So
yes.
Maybe I'm a little bit higher. But let's talk about draft the PT. Obviously, you talked about drafting Azalea, and then you drafted Assassin in your second draft. I wanted to, I guess, find out a bit about kind of how were your matches? You know, did you feel like you kind of just aced the draft and you had really strong decks that led you to kind of have, I wouldn't say, you know, an easy time of it, but a better run where you felt really confident in your matches? Or, you know, did you have a lot of sort of closely sort of contested matches at the PT?
I think most of my matches were closely contested. There might have been like one complete run over with the crazy Azalea deck or something like that, but really strong opponents, first of all, and mostly really close matches. My first the Azalea deck, it was 22 arrows, 1 yellow toxicity, and 7 red pumps. So it's really living the dream. I had to cut Ravenous Rebel red, and I had to cut 2 red arrows because they weren't the best arrows for Azalea, right? Because Azalea wants all the arrows except Falcon Wing, Murkmire Grapnel, and Skybound Shot. So all of my 22 arrows were the others, right? Oh. The on hits, the Widowmakers, and the Spire Snipings. So I was the only Azalea in the pod. There was 1 Riptide in the pod. I could get everything I ever wanted. So I was really living the dream. 2 Lace with Frailties, 1 Lace with Blood Rot, 1 red Fletcher Red Tail, 3 Scout the Peripheries, I think, something like that. So those games were kind of, they were difficult because my opponents were strong and they had strong ninja decks, which put a lot of pressure on me. But otherwise, I think I, in a sense, earned the wins with my deck because I was both lucky and knew how to draft the seat. So, because what you do with the deck is you play, after you played all the pumps, you can always blind Azalea into an arrow. That is usually relevant unless you hit a Spire Sniping. So against Zach Bunn in the pod final, I could, after I played all my pumps and had gone through my deck, basically, I could start blind Azaleaing into an arrow and always push damage through. So I had inevitability in the deck that you don't always have if you have to put these things like Feisty Locals or Peace of Minds in your deck.
And then your second, I guess, draft pod, how was the deck? Did you feel overall? Like if you were to give the second, it sounds like your Azalea deck was kind of like maybe an 8 to 9 out of 10. What about your Assassin deck and the second pod? How did that go?
I think my Azalea deck was a 10 out of 10, to be honest. Right. I don't think I'll ever draft as strong an Azalea deck. But my second one was super consistent. I think I had like 15 stealth cards and something like 10 or 11 payoffs. If you count the spike, I think I had a spike with Frailty and then like 9 or 10 payoff attacks. So super consistent. I could almost switch an attack in every turn and then block for 3 most of the time on my opponent's turns. And I think there were like 4. There might have been like 4 assassins in the pod. most of them were to my left, because early on in the draft I was picking the 6s and the sneak attacks, and I was passing a lot of strong stealth cards. So a lot of the people on my left went to assassin, but that didn't really hurt me that much because I could just take the yellow prowls and the blue maligns or whatever at the end of the draft and just fill out my deck. So I think I won off of consistency, but really strong opponents, really good games. I had to make a lot of decisions, which is what I like about this format. That the games are a little bit longer, means you have to make a lot more decisions, and every one of those counts. So
yep.
So shout out to all my opponents.
I guess last question for me before I ask you just maybe recap some key learnings is pack distribution at the PT. Got asked the question. We asked Tarek the question on the main pod last week. Did you feel that it was less than ideal? Were you okay with how the pack distribution ended up? Did you have any kind of overall thoughts, or did it just not really matter to you?
I fully understood the decision that LSS made, because it's almost the only one they could. Because otherwise there would be a lot of complaints on some of the people around the world being, disadvantaged. So I think it made sense. I tried not to pay too much attention to it. Where it did matter is when, I guess it was pack 2 in my first draft, pack 2, when I or like the pick 2 when I got passed after the first pick. I saw only one ninja card in the pack, and I thought that there's some probability that this is a fully Japanese pack, and if it's a fully Japanese pack, and there's only one ninja card left, I think it's like an 80% plus probability that somebody took a ninja card. I think we did the math early on in the when they did the Japanese box breaks. So I tried to avoid ninja based on that. So I thought it was like at least a 50% chance that somebody took a ninja card. But that's pretty much it. After that, I didn't really pay much attention. And I think Tarek even said that they were like a mix of Belgian and Japanese. That would really surprise me. But that's a lot of work that they had to put in to build these packs. So I guess kudos for that. But I did as they told me. I focused on the fundamentals, and I think it was fine.
Yeah, I mean, 6-0 draft, I think it probably worked out all right.
Yeah.
All right, Juha. I want to play, before we run out of time, to play pack one, pick one with you, but I just want to give you kind of the floor to just anything else that you want to mention from the PT, any kind of, big takeaways you had from, your 6-0 draft run, anything else you want to tell us about before we play pack one, pick one.
I think most of the learnings from this draft format, were not like very new news to most of you. So listening to Limited Time Only, listening to On the Bobble, I could hear most of those things in those, but the decision tree I had to learn for myself. So if there's one takeaway for the listeners here, is that decision tree is a little bit weird because of Ranger, because of the things I said about Riptide and Azalea being very different. Azalea only really wanting to play Pumps and Arrows and just a couple other cards, then it means that your decision tree on picking your hero has a very particular shape, and you need to keep that in mind when you're picking your early picks, and you need to keep that in mind when you think that a card keeps you open, but it actually doesn't as much as you think. So that's the one thing I want everyone to pick up on.
Cool. Okay, great takeaway. All right, let's play pack one, pick one. You have a pack that's been sent your way. I'm going to, while you maybe deliberate if you haven't already, I'm just going to read the contents of the pack out for those audio listeners. Video watchers can see this on YouTube. But in this pack, we have a red Razor's Edge, a blue Scout the Periphery, a red Descendant Gustwave, a yellow Prowl, a blue Destructive Deliberation, red Falcon Wing, blue 1-2 Punch, yellow Peace of Mind, blue Spire Sniping, Blade, Cuff, Frailty Trap, Backstab, Boulder Trap, and then we have a foil equipment in Fleetfoot Sandals. So I'm going to pass it over to you. Juha, what are the first things you're looking at in this pack? How do you kind of sort of sort or look at your pack first of all, and then I guess talk us through what you're taking?
Well, first of all, I of course need to know if this is a Japanese or Belgian pack. But if we're drafting all Japanese, then I would need to know how many of the class commons are there. So can I cut a really strong signal? And that also depends a lot on who's to my left. Like if I know the player to my left, are they going to know the pack collation? Are they going to pay attention to me cutting a ninja card or a ranger card or something like that? Most often, I would say the answer is no, because there's always a good chance that even a strong player just doesn't pay attention at the time into that, and then your very, very advanced signaling stuff goes to waste. So I would rather focus a little bit more on the fundamentals, but that's the first thing I'd like to know. Secondly, I'm noticing that there are 2, 2, and 2 of the class commons, so that's maybe a useful thing to know. And then I look at all the strong cards, the first pickable cards, and I think in this pack I see 4. I'd say so. There's Razor's Edge Red, which is probably the strongest assassin common, especially for Arachne. Descendant Gustwave Red, which is probably the strongest Katsu common, and a really strong one in Benji as well. Blade Cuff, which is you always just want to make sure that you have blade break equipment, and it keeps you open for those 2 classes. And then there's Frailty Trap, which is a good assassin card, a really great Riptide card, and not that good in Azalea. But those 4 is what I would think about. I think Blade Cuff is something that it fills a slot that you can probably fill later. So I'm not super high on that, but it is the one of these 4 that keeps you the most open, I would say. Frailty Trap, it's like if you want to stay open for Riptide, then having picked traps is the best way to do that. Because if you decide, around pick 5 or 7 that you want to go Riptide, if you have a couple traps already, then it helps you a tremendous amount, because you're like the dream Riptide deck has like 10 traps. So I would consider that to keep me open, or then I would pick one of the strong class commons. And out of those, I think Razor's Edge is probably a little bit stronger, and also you end up on Assassin more often than you end up on Ninja, so it pseudo keeps you open in that sense. But I'd probably pick the Razor's Edge Red, just because of how extremely strong it is in Arachne, where you, I guess, most often end up as an assassin. But I wouldn't consider that locking me in any way, right? So if I see that assassin is cut, or if I start seeing strong cards for other classes, I can pick those, and I'm not married to my pick. So Razor's Edge Red is what I pick here.
Cool. Lock it in. Great pick, I think. Agree with everything you've said. The only other things I wanted to add to kind of what you've said there about this pack is I think if you do end up taking that Frailty Trap, there's a potential that you wield the Boulder Trap, which is not the most exciting card, but if you end up in Riptide, as you say, and you're maybe getting a pick 6 or 7 signal, and then you wheel that back, it's a nice to have. And then the other thing was, if you do take the Descendant Gustwave here, you talked about that kind of sending a signal. You take the best ninja card in the pack, and you pass a card that is fine, and you'd be more than happy to wheel back in that 1-2 punch, and you almost potentially could as well, if you did commit to ninja. But like you say, taking that doesn't mean you're committed to ninja. You're not married to that first pick. So yeah, it's an interesting pack. It has a few options, like you say. I think I'd be on Razor's Edge as well. I think that card is just super, super safe and also very powerful. So, all right, that's pack 1, pick 1. Juha, thank you for playing. We're going to wrap it up there. I did just want to give you sort of this last minute to, I guess, if people want to find you, they maybe want to follow you on social media or what you're doing in Flesh and Blood. Maybe you could also tell us, where to find you, but what events are you going to be at for the rest of the year? People, I'm sure, would love to know.
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter at BrambleSpark. I've been more and more active there, especially after the PT. I really, really love Fab Twitter. I'm really surprised about how positive a gaming community can be as it is in Fab. So let's keep that up. Event-wise, I will be going to Calling Antwerp next week, or depending on when this comes out, maybe it's this week. And Calling Birmingham in July is still up in the air. I would really like to go. The European callings are a really, really fun events to travel to and meet all the people. And Worlds, I would very much like to go. I'm currently qualified on both limited and constructed rating. Let's see what happens down the line. But that depends on if we can make our schedules work, because my wife will be working at that time. I'll be on parental leave, and we need to see if we can make the timing work. But Worlds, of course, is I would really, really love to go. And yeah, that's it.
Cool. Well, I want to say a massive thank you, Juha, for coming on. Massive congratulations on your PT run in your top 4. And hopefully I do get the chance to see you in person at Worlds. But again, just want to say a massive thank you and thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, until next week, we'll see you in the next episode of Limited Time Only.